On the frozen edge of Detroit, Henry Walker stood silent, letting his son's words strike him like stones. They hadn't found him in a home but in a junkyard beside a rust-eaten RV they saw as yet another doomed dream. To them, he was just a father who failed one too many times. But just as the weight of shame was about to crush him, Rusty, the stray German shepherd he had rescued from the storm, stepped forward. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply sat between Henry and the hurt, a quiet but fierce shield, his amber eyes burning with one message: this man is worth fighting for. That single, silent act of loyalty changed everything. A slate-colored winter sky pressed low over Detroit, the wind carving through abandoned streets like a blade. Henry Walker guided his battered Ford pickup through the iron gates of Miller's Scrap and Salvage, the engine coughing as if it too had grown weary of life's disappointments. At 68, Henry looked older than his years, tall but stooped, his once strong frame shaved down by time and hunger. His shoulders slumped beneath a faded military green jacket, whose patches had long ago peeled away. His hair, cropped short from habit, was now more frost-white than brown, and wrinkles branched outward from his soft blue eyes, like a map of battles fought quietly within. Those eyes, once sharp with discipline and purpose, now carried the heaviness of a man who had spent too long staring into futures that never came. Inside the truck cab sat everything he owned: 2 duffel bags with frayed straps, a few shirts, an old photograph of his children, and a set of tools he could barely bring himself to look at anymore. The heater had quit months back, leaving his breath to fog in the freezing air as he pulled to a stop. The gravel crunched beneath the tires, echoing through the vast yard of towering scrap heaps. Rusted vehicles lay gutted and skeletal, their windows shattered like blank staring eyes. Sheets of twisted metal leaned against one another, like gravestones marking the remains of forgotten lives. The smell of cold steel mixed with wet earth and engine oil, sharp and metallic enough to taste. Henry sat motionless for a moment, his hands resting on the cracked steering wheel. He could feel the cold through the leather, could feel hopelessness waiting just outside the truck door like a stray that refused to leave. He had reached the end of the road, and he knew it. Miller's Scrap and Salvage wasn't just a junkyard, it was the graveyard of his last chances. Once upon a time, after his honorable discharge from the U.S. Army, Henry had built something: Walker Custom Woodworks, a workshop filled with fresh pine scent and the music of saws and chisels. He poured everything into it, his savings, his skill, his pride. And for a while it worked. He was a husband, a father, a craftsman. People trusted him. They smiled when they saw him. But hope has sharp edges. The recession hit hard. Orders slowed to a trickle, and debt swelled faster than he could cut it down. The stress twisted him, turned the kind, patient father into a man always counting bills and cursing numbers. He stayed up late fixing problems that didn't stay fixed. Eventually, the bank padlocked the shop door. His wife walked away soon after, tired of trying to love a sinking ship. Then his children, grown angry, exhausted by disappointment, stopped answering his calls. That failure, more than any battlefield, was the one that wounded him deepest. Henry blinked away the memory and inhaled the icy air like penance. The office door creaked open, and out stepped Frank Miller, owner of the yard. Frank was in his 70s, stocky and wide-shouldered from decades of lifting engines and transmissions. His denim overalls were permanently stained with grease, and his right leg dragged just slightly, with every step a souvenir from a factory accident that ended his younger years with a limp. His face bore rough edges, a squarish jaw dusted with a gray beard, thick eyebrows like thunderclouds, and deep grooves around his mouth carved there by years of labor and loss. He was a man who endured, and his presence made the cold wind seem less biting. Frank rapped once on the driver's window. "This ain't no place to park for free," he grumbled, his voice gravelly, shaped by diesel fumes and hard truths. Henry rolled the window down, letting in a blast of icy wind that made him shiver. "I'm not here to park," Henry said quietly, the words scraping out of his throat like they didn't want to leave. "I'm here for work." Frank's sharp eyes studied the man before him. He noticed the military ID peeking out of the visor, the tiredness wrapped around Henry, like wet clothing. The kind of defeated posture he'd only seen in veterans who had survived the war, but not the peace. "Name?" Frank asked. "Henry Walker." Frank nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. "Come with me." Henry stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching through snow-crusted gravel. He followed Frank through narrow lanes between mountains of crushed metal. The wind whistled through broken windows of the scrap cars, making hollow, ghostly notes. No words were spoken. Silence was easier than questions neither of them wanted to answer. At last, Frank stopped in the farthest corner of the yard. There, half buried in a nest of blackberry vines, sat a Winnebago RV, the ugliest thing Henry had ever seen. Its paint, once white, had peeled away in strips, revealing dull metal beneath. Moss clung stubbornly to the roof, and 3 of the tires sat flat, defeated by years of stillness. A cracked vent dangled uselessly along its side like a broken limb. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a carcass. Henry frowned. Frank slapped a hand against the RV, and the sound was a hollow thud. "She's a relic," he admitted. "Plumbing's shot engine don't run. But the frame's solid. Roof barely leaks." The tip of Frank's beard quivered as he let out a slow breath that steamed into the frozen air. "I need someone to sort scrap metal during the day. Copper and aluminum mostly. And a night watchman. Kids like to sneak in sometimes, try to steal parts or spray paint the place. I can't keep an eye out 24 hours. Henry felt the faintest spark stir in his chest, not hope, but a cousin to it. A reason to stay warm. Frank continued, "You live here. You take care of the yard. That'll be your payment." Henry stared at the RV again. It was terrifying, ugly, and cold, and full of ghosts of whoever had abandoned it. But it was also something incredible, a roof. A door he could lock. A place to exhale. "This isn't charity," Frank added, crossing his arms. "You'll work for your keep. That's all I want." Henry replied, the words coming out steadier than he felt. He reached for his wallet. Inside was a $1 bill worn thin and creased from too many nights of pretending it meant luck. He unfolded it slowly and placed it into Frank's weathered hand, an offering, a contract, a lifeline. Frank nodded once, approval given not through a smile but through the absence of refusal. He handed Henry a rusted heavy key, the metal cold enough to sting. "Welcome home," Frank muttered. Night fell early in Detroit, and as Henry unlocked the RV door, a stale smell of dust and dampness greeted him. The air inside was thick, untouched by warmth for years. The curtains hung stiff with grime and dust, coated every surface like forgotten snow. He lowered himself onto one of the cracked vinyl benches, and the jolt of cold from the seat shot straight into his bones. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering as the temperature inside dropped like a stone. It was the lowest place his life had ever led him. But for the first time in months, maybe years, Henry felt stillness, not the kind that comes from giving up, but the kind that comes from having a place, however small, to begin again. He had a key. He had a job. He had a roof. The wind howled outside, but Henry's heart, fragile and aching, held something close to relief. A broken man in a broken RV in a broken city. But tonight he was not sleeping in his truck waiting for a knock from the police. Tonight he belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was the last place anyone would want to be. And in that quiet, lonely corner of Detroit, Henry allowed himself the smallest, most dangerous luxury of all, the belief that tomorrow might hurt a little less. The storm arrived without mercy. The fourth night at Miller's Scrap and Salvage became a violent symphony of wind and ice, the sky splitting open above Detroit, as though punishing the world below. Snow hammered the roof of Henry's rusted RV in furious, uneven rhythms. The walls trembled with every gust, and the cold seeped in through every crack and seam like an unwelcome intruder. Inside, Henry Walker lay curled beneath a thin wool blanket, teeth clenched and muscles taut, as his breath fogged the dim air. He'd layered his jacket over himself and tucked his boots beneath his legs, yet the cold still stabbed through him with surgical precision. The RV was a shelter in name only. Its metal skin provided no warmth, only a barrier against the teeth of the storm. The wind howled, rattling the thin windows, until it sounded like the cries of restless ghosts clawing to be let in. Just as Henry felt his mind slipping into that numb, half-conscious state where exhaustion fights the shivering body, a faint sound pierced through the storm's roar, a soft, desperate whimper. At first he ignored it, squeezing his eyes shut. He was exhausted from carrying a life that felt like it no longer wanted him. And whatever poor thing was out there, well, he wasn't sure he had anything left to offer. The whimper came again, accompanied by a scratch, a slow, weak scrape beneath the RV floor. Henry's heart tensed. He tried to reason with himself, maybe it was just a loose branch or debris pushed by the wind. But another cry came thinner this time, trembling with a fear and pain he recognized too well. With a reluctant sigh that felt like sandpaper in his chest, Henry pulled himself upright. He grabbed the heavy flashlight Frank had given him and shoved open the RV door. The storm reached in instantly, slapping his face with icy snow and stealing breath from his lungs. He stepped into the freezing darkness, boots sinking into a layer of slush and mud. When he knelt, the cold bit deep into his knees through his worn jeans, but he forced himself lower, angling the flashlight beneath the RV. Two golden pinpricks reflected back at him eyes, a pair of terrified, intelligent eyes. He steadied the flashlight and the shape became clear, a German shepherd, though barely recognizable as the noble breed. The dog was emaciated, its ribs sharp beneath a silver-gray coat matted with mud and grime. Its ears, normally proud and alert for shepherds, drooped low, and its tail lay pressed tight between its legs. It shook violently, every tremor a quiet plea for a world that seemed determined to forget it. What struck Henry most was not the dog's condition, but the silence. No growl, no snarl, just a desperate, instinctive attempt to vanish. Henry's throat tightened. He saw himself curled beneath some metaphorical chassis, trying to survive where nobody could see. "Easy," Henry said, his voice hoarse from disuse. The dog flinched. He retreated a step, not to frighten it further, but to gather the courage to care. He went back inside, his fingers numb, as he rummaged through his meager supplies. His dinner, a half-can of cheap beans, waited beside a dented fork. Hunger twisted his stomach, but something deeper twisted harder. He scooped what remained into a tin plate and returned outside. Kneeling again, he pushed the dish into the shadows within reach of the trembling animal. The shepherd didn't move. Hunger waged war against terror in its amber eyes. Then, in a sudden lunge, it devoured the food in desperate gulps, never once looking away from Henry. When the plate was licked clean, the dog retreated once more into the darkest corner under the RV, as if ashamed of needing help. Snow soaked Henry's jacket and hair, until both clung cold and heavy against his skin. He stood there a moment longer, just staring into that darkness that had stared back at him. Then he returned inside, leaving the RV door open a few inches. A silent invitation. If the world wouldn't give either of them grace, then he would have to give it to someone else. Morning arrived muted after the storm, the sky a dull gray shroud. Henry woke suddenly, his first thought not of his hunger or cold, but of the dog. He scrambled toward the door, heart thumping with anxious hope. And there it was, curled on the muddy ground by the step head resting on its paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. It had stayed. Henry's heart twisted again, not from pain, but from purpose. "Well now," he murmured, voice softer than he remembered it could be. "You're still here." The dog raised its head, ears slightly lifting, as though trying to understand the words. Henry broke the stale bread. He'd saved a thin breakfast, but he offered half to the shepherd. They shared the meal in silence, man and dog sitting together in the cold, bound by hunger and the knowledge that neither had much left except each other. Rusty, Henry said suddenly. The name arrived uninvited, feeling right the moment it left his lips. The dog blinked, ears twitching again. A tiny acceptance. Rusty. A name was a beginning. The wind had calmed by midday, and with determination Henry didn't fully understand, he began cleaning inside the RV. Living on trash felt like surrender. And now, he wasn't alone. Rusty followed him inside, hesitantly sniffing each corner with cautious curiosity, but staying close enough that Henry could feel the warmth of his presence. The dog moved stiffly, likely older than he first seemed, maybe 8 or 9 years, aged faster by struggle. There was a wisdom in his eyes, a weary nobility. Henry could relate. As Henry wiped years of neglect from grimy counters and swept the dust into piles, Rusty became fascinated with one corner beneath a built-in bench. He sniffed eagerly, tail giving a tentative wag, then scratched at the base of the seat. "What's got into you, partner?" Henry muttered. Rusty let out a short whine, scratching harder. Intrigued, Henry crouched and ran a hand along the bench base. His fingers caught a recessed latch nearly invisible beneath grime. A hidden panel. He hesitated, heart suddenly pounding. Then he pulled. The panel popped open with a long, complaining creak. Inside, the dark compartment smelled faintly of cedar and old oil. Henry reached in his fingers, brushing thick canvas. He pulled out an old metal toolbox, its green paint-chipped latch tarnished but intact. The weight of it struck him instantly with recognition. He forced the latch open, and there they were, woodworking tools. Carving knives with smooth wooden handles. A block plane polished by decades of use. Chisels, a sharpening stone. A craftsman's heart preserved in steel and timber. His breath caught, and his right hand, once so steady, began to tremble. Memories crashed down like falling lumber. The smell of sawdust. His daughter's laughter in the workshop. The pride in his wife's eyes the day he hung his first custom cabinet in their kitchen. And then, the shouting, the bills, the foreclosures. Silence replacing everything that once made him whole. Henry slammed the box shut, squeezing his eyes against the tears that gathered uninvited. He wasn't ready to feel this yet. He wasn't sure he ever could be again. Rusty nudged the box with his nose, then looked up at Henry. There was no judgment in those amber eyes, only simple belief. Henry swallowed hard. His fingers still trembled, but he placed his palm atop the box again. Maybe this wasn't punishment. Maybe it was a chance. Not to rebuild the life he'd lost, but to carve a new one from the ruins. For himself, and for the dog who chose him. The storm outside had passed, and inside that battered RV something like hope quietly thawed. Morning light crept through the thin RV curtains, like a shy visitor turning the stale air a faint gold. Rusty lay curled at Henry Walker's feet, his breathing soft and steady. The dog had chosen him. Henry reminded himself of that every time he opened his eyes and saw that gray-white head resting beside him. That alone was reason enough to get up each day. In the scrapyard, winter sunlight didn't warm much. It merely exposed the frost clinging to every piece of metal. Henry's breath hung in front of him as he stepped outside to start his new routine, sorting through the heaps of discarded appliances for copper and aluminum. The work was rough on his hands, but it gave structure to hours that otherwise might collapse into memories and regret. Rusty followed, walking stiffly but loyally, his ribs no longer showing quite so sharply thanks to shared meals. When the physical labor was done, Henry returned to the RV with aching arms and a mind that wouldn't sit still. The toolbox still sat where he left it, accusing him, reminding him. His right hand trembled slightly as he lifted the lid again. One carving knife lay across the red felt lining its wooden handle, smooth with age. He felt the tremor increase, fear maybe, or longing. Rusty nudged his elbow gently, amber eyes curious and encouraging. "All right," Henry murmured. "Just a little." He found a fist-sized scrap of pine among the scrapwood pile. Sitting on the RV step, he placed the block in his left hand and the knife in his right. The first cut was shaky, the blade skittering awkwardly. Frustration swelled hot in his chest. His failures always seemed to follow him into every new hope. Rusty pressed his head against Henry's thigh, as if insisting, "Try again." So Henry breathed. He grounded himself in the grain of the wood, the rough edge of each curl shaving free. Slowly, the tremor eased. The hours, usually loud with doubts, fell silent. When he finally stopped carving, he held a tiny wooden dog in his palm. Its ears perked up, tail curved, just like Rusty when he heard food crack open. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive in its own small way. Frank Miller arrived later, his heavy boots clanking against junkyard gravel. His gruff demeanor softened as he spotted Henry's creation. "That looks like you carved a piece of your heart into it," Frank remarked, his voice low. Frank was a man with hands made for engines, not delicate things, but his eyes understood craftsmanship, likely because he understood struggle. "There's a flea market down by the river every Saturday," Frank continued. "You could take some pieces down there. Folks sometimes pay good money for something made by real hands." Henry's stomach twisted. Selling meant exposing himself to people, to judgment. Still, the thought of earning even a few dollars by creating again lit a nervous spark in his chest. Throughout the week, Henry carved more awkward birds, a stiff-legged cat, another dog or two, each one a little smoother, a little surer. His hands remembered the language of wood, even if his confidence did not. Rusty stayed close, always watching, always there to give a nudge when despair crept in. Soon, Saturday arrived. The flea market bustled with life despite the bitter cold, colorful tents popping against the gray sky like small acts of defiance. Music from an old radio mixed with the smell of fried onions and engine oil. People rummaged through tables of tools, vintage magazines, mismatched furniture, old coats, treasures, or trash, depending on the eye. Henry found an empty patch of cracked pavement near the stone bridge. Frank had lent him a folding table, and Henry spread a worn blanket across it to display his wooden animals. Rusty settled at his feet, head resting on his paws, but eyes alert to everything around them. Henry sat, pulled his jacket closer, and waited. People passed by, dozens of them. Some glanced, some pretended not to see, and some smiled politely and moved on. Every passing moment felt heavier. Voices from his past clawed their way up. "You can't provide. You're wasting time. You will fail again." His heartbeat drummed loudly. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe this is pathetic. He reached to start packing up, and then, a gentle voice breathed. Henry looked up. An elderly woman stood before his table. Her hair was soft and silver curled neatly around a kind, delicate face. She leaned on a carved wooden cane that suggested elegance in her younger years. Her skin was pale with age spots like faded flower petals. "Did you make these?" she asked, eyes shining with true interest. "Yes, ma'am," Henry said, surprised his voice held steady. She picked up the wooden cat, a small piece with a slightly crooked tail. She turned it slowly in her fragile hands, smiling with a mixture of tenderness and memory. "This looks just like Mittens," she whispered. "She used to curl up by my fireplace every night, before she passed last spring." There was love and grief intertwined in her words. Henry felt it like a mirror. How much, she asked. Henry had no idea what to say. $5, he guessed, voice cracking with doubt. She didn't hesitate. She opened a neatly pressed wallet and placed a crisp $5 bill into his cold fingers. "You've made an old woman very happy today," she said, slipping the cat into her coat pocket. As she walked away, Henry stared at the bill. For anyone else, it was small, a snack, a bus ticket. But to him, it was proof. Rusty gave his tail a single thump of approval. The rest of the afternoon passed easier. A father bought a little wooden dog for his giggling son. A young woman purchased 2 birds to hang in her apartment. No crowd rushed him, but he sold enough to fold up his table with $35 in his pocket, more money than he had held in a long time. He walked back to the junkyard lighter than he had left it. He bought a large bag of good dog food, something with real meat, not filler, and a few pieces of quality wood and sandpaper. Rusty ate like a king that night. Yet hope is fragile. Sometimes it's only one harsh word away from breaking. A few days later, while Henry sanded the worn RV doorframe trying to make the place feel a little more like home, the sound of a powerful engine cut through the scrapyard's quiet. A sleek silver sedan rolled to a stop near the office. The contrast of that spotless car against rusted chaos made Henry's chest tighten. The doors opened. His son Ethan Walker stepped out first. He was 28, tall like his father, but with a rigid posture. His hair, once messy from soccer games and bike rides, was trimmed neatly. A crisp shirt, pressed slacks, polished shoes, Ethan looked like a man who needed control, the world tidy and predictable. Anger hardened his jaw, and beneath that anger was fear, fear of chaos, fear of losing everything again. Grace followed. At 24, she had the gentleness of their mother, soft brown hair tied loosely, cheeks flushed pink from cold and worry. Her coat was oversized, making her look smaller, more fragile than Henry remembered. They saw the RV. They saw him. They saw Rusty. Grace brought a hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. Ethan's eyes filled with something sharp, betrayal or shame or both. "We've been searching for you," Ethan snapped, voice tight. "Calling, asking around." "I'm okay," Henry answered softly. "I'm working here." Ethan scoffed, the sound shallow and cold. "Working, Dad? You're living in a junkyard, selling little toys at a flea market." His words were knives he didn't know how to stop throwing. Grace touched his arm gently. "Ethan, no." He shook her off. "This is just like last time. You get some idea in your head and everything falls apart." Each accusation hit Henry harder because he'd said these things to himself countless nights. His throat burned, the world blurred. Shame filled every crack inside him. He felt himself shrinking, curling inward as if bracing for a blow. And then Rusty rose, calm, steady. The shepherd walked forward and sat directly in front of Henry, making himself a shield of fur and loyalty. His amber eyes stared up at Ethan, not in challenge, but in heartbreaking confusion, as though asking, "Why would you hurt him?" The yard fell silent. The wind quieted. Even Ethan's anger paused for a second, thrown off by this unexpected noble defense. Grace's tears finally fell. Ethan clenched his fists and looked away, unable to bear the weight of his own words. "We're leaving," he muttered. Grace hesitated, meeting her father's eyes, pleading silently for something neither knew how to say. Then she followed her brother to the car. The sedan drove away, leaving gravel dust swirling, and Henry standing frozen. Rusty pressed his head against Henry's leg, and Henry sank down onto the cold RV step, burying his face into Rusty's fur, the only steady thing he had left. Detroit's winter did not soften overnight, but something inside Henry Walker had shifted, even if he did not yet understand how. After the painful encounter with his children, silence became thicker in the RV, pressing into him, like the weight of unsaid apologies. Rusty, ever perceptive, rarely left his side. His warm body and steady gaze, the closest thing to comfort Henry had known in years. What Henry did not know was that someone else could not forget him either. In her small apartment downtown, Grace Walker lay awake, the image of her father's hollow cheeks and Rusty's silent defense replaying again and again. The guilt of leaving him there, abandoned among the ruins of Detroit, gnawed at her heart. Early the next morning, before Ethan woke, she paced the living room floor, clutching her phone. She hesitated, breath quivering, then dialed the number Frank had given her on a crumpled business card Ethan never noticed. Frank Miller, that tough old mechanic bearing years heavier than his age, answered with his usual growl. Grace's voice cracked as she asked about her father. Frank listened without judgment. His deep-set brown eyes softened as he stared out the office window toward the lone RV and the man he had allowed to stay there. In a low, honest voice, Frank told her everything Henry had not. How he worked without complaint in the bitter cold. How he carved little figures at night to keep hope alive. How Rusty had become his shadow and his lifeline. Grace wiped tears from her cheeks, thanking Frank in a whisper. She promised she would make things right. Somehow. The next day, Frank knocked on Henry's RV door. Henry opened it with a cautious expression. He was still bruised from Ethan's accusations. Frank simply said, "Put on something warm. We're going into town." No explanation. No room for refusal. Henry followed, confusion simmering beneath his ribs. Frank drove the old tow truck through slushy roads until a brick building appeared, Detroit Veterans Support Center. The signage was faded, but the American flag fluttered proudly above it. Inside, the heat hit Henry first, then the smell coffee paper and a hint of old carpet. People moved through the lobby, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes, all carrying stories the world rarely cared to hear. At a desk covered in neatly stacked forms sat Walter Henderson, a retired Marine in his early 70s. His thick white mustache twitched when he spoke, and his posture, though stiff from arthritis, still bore the unmistakable discipline of a man who once commanded respect and still quietly demanded it. His olive skin was lined deeply, especially around sea-gray eyes that had seen too much. A faded purple heart pin glimmered on his vest. He introduced himself with a handshake firm enough to remind Henry what strength felt like. "Frank here says you need help," Henderson began. "Let's see what your country owes you." The word "owes" startled Henry. He had long convinced himself he wasn't owed anything, not after his failures. But Henderson insisted he sit. Then typed Henry's name into the government database with surprisingly quick fingers for someone of his age. Minutes stretched into years as Henderson searched. Then he frowned, leaned in, clicked again. Well, that's your problem, Henderson finally said, pointing to the screen. Your disability claim never got processed. Not denied, just lost. Bureaucracy at its finest. Henry blinked. Lost for how long years? Henderson replied, face tightening with righteous anger. All because some clerk mailed one letter to the wrong address. It felt like a cruel joke. Henry's sacrifices, his injuries physical and invisible, had been misplaced like junk mail. He sat frozen while Henderson printed forms calling a nurse to schedule Henry's evaluation. We'll fix this, Henderson said firmly. You served your country. Now let your country serve you. Rusty, waiting patiently near the door with Frank, wagged his tail as Henry approached, almost like he sensed something big had begun. Weeks later, after medical examinations and paperwork signed until his hand ached, Henry tried not to expect anything. Expectation had betrayed him too often. But the day came anyway. The winter sun shone rare and almost delicate when Frank strode toward the RV waving a thick white envelope stamped United States Department of Veterans Affairs. Henry's heart kicked against his ribs like it wanted to escape. He tore the seal with trembling fingers. He read the first line, then reread it. Approved for 70% disability benefits with full retroactive compensation. Money would come. Real money. Enough to survive. Enough to breathe. Enough to live like a man again. But it was the next line that broke him completely. Acknowledged service-connected trauma and physical injury. Acknowledged. He had not imagined the pain. He had not been weak. He had been wounded and recognized. Henry dropped the letter, covering his face with both hands as tears surged uncontrollably. Rusty pressed his head into Henry's shin, whining softly, anchoring him to the earth. Frank looked away respectfully, busying himself with checking a tow cable, though his eyes glimmered. Later inside the RV, Henry and Frank spread sheets of paper across the table like generals planning a mission, because that's what this was, the reclamation of a life. We start with the engine, Frank declared, stabbing a finger at the list. No point fixing a house that can't move. Henry nodded eagerly. For the first time in years, he felt excitement, sharp, unfamiliar, electric. With Henderson's guidance, Henry joined a small network of retired tradesmen willing to barter skills. Through this quiet brotherhood of broken but unbowed men, the RV's transformation began. Tom Sanders, a retired electrician with large wire-calloused hands and a Santa-like belly, arrived the next morning. His beard was thick, snowy white, and his laugh enormous, yet his eyes held a hidden grief. He never spoke about a son lost in Afghanistan. Henry built him a handcrafted shelf from cedar, polished to a soft glow. Tom wired the RV with care, sealing every connection like it protected his own heart. Marcus Reed, a plumber with salt and pepper stubble and sleeves rolled up to reveal tattooed forearms, came next. He had once dreamed of opening a restaurant with his wife before cancer stole her away. Now he filled his days helping others fix what was broken. In exchange for new pipes, a water heater, and a functioning sink, Henry carved his wife's favorite flower, an iris, into the sides of 2 wooden planters. The RV became a hive of purposeful sound drills, saws, laughter that occasionally slipped free. Henry patched leaks, insulated walls, cleaned every corner until his fingers smelled permanently of wood and hope. Rusty supervised everything, occasionally sneaking kisses to the workers who rewarded him with head scratches and treats. When they finally primed the RV's exterior to paint, Henry stepped back and stared with disbelief. This vehicle, this discarded shell that once symbolized his lowest moment, was becoming a home. Not perfect, not fancy, but real. His. As night fell, Henry lit a small battery-powered lantern and sat on the newly sanded bench inside. Rusty settled beside him, head on his knee. Henry whispered into the quiet, "We're not done yet, boy. But we're getting there." And for the first time, the RV no longer felt cold. It felt alive. The sun over Detroit was pale and slow to rise, but its timid glow crept across the snow-covered junkyard just as Henry Walker tightened the final screw into a polished birchwood panel. Inside the once ruined RV, warmth had taken root not just from the insulation he'd installed, but from the careful labor and hope he poured into every detail. The floors, previously soft with rot, were now solid beneath smooth planks he sanded until they gleamed faintly like satin. The walls, covered in fresh birch paneling, wrapped the interior in a soft, honey-colored glow that made the place feel like an intimate cabin deep in the woods, rather than a metal box surrounded by mountains of scrap. The kitchenette was tiny, but built so precisely that every cabinet door closed with a satisfying click, the hinges crafted to fit without the slightest squeak. A small convertible table folded neatly into the wall should space ever be needed. And the bed, no longer a pile of stained cushions, was a sturdy wooden frame Henry built with the care he once reserved for cradles and dining tables in his old woodworking shop. As he worked, Rusty, a now healthy German shepherd, with a thickening winter coat of silver and sable, trotted around the RV like a foreman on four paws. He inspected every corner, sniffed new materials, and lay nearby whenever Henry paused, offering a nudge or a reassuring huff. The dog had filled out significantly since that desperate first night under the RV. His ribs no longer showed. Confidence replaced fear. He was still cautious around strangers, but with Henry, he was joy in motion. And Henry, he was changing too. Every board he fit perfectly into place stitched another piece of his heart back together. Every line of wood grain reminded him that broken things could be shaped into something strong again, maybe even beautiful. But two pieces of wood remained untouched, special ones. One was a fine slab of cherry wood, deep red with swirls like river currents. The other was walnut, dark and dignified, the type of wood he saved only for projects made with love and memory. These were not for the RV. These were for his children. Grace Walker, the daughter who had inherited her father's soft eyes, was expecting her first child. She was petite, with pale skin and chestnut hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. Her smile had always carried warmth like sunlight through windows, at least before disappointment had dimmed it. For her, Henry crafted a cradle hand-shaped smooth as river stones. Along its curved rockers he carved tiny birds, each looking ready to lift into flight, symbolizing hope for the little life yet to join the world. For Ethan, his son, the walnut block transformed into a miniature tool chest. Inside, perfectly carved, was every tiny tool from Henry's own childhood memories: a little hammer, a little saw, a little screwdriver. Once long ago, Henry had made a full-sized version of this gift when Ethan turned 8. Back then, Ethan had beamed with pride, believing his father could build anything. Henry wiped away a tear as he oiled the inside of the miniature chest. If wood held memories, then walnut held a lifetime. When the last coat of varnish dried, he didn't delay. He picked up his phone with steady hands and called Grace. His voice no longer wavered. His words no longer hid his heart. "I want you and your brother to come," he said simply. "I have something for you both." Grace's voice trembled, but there was no hesitation. "We'll be there, Dad." The next morning, the same sleek gray sedan crunched through the snow toward the junkyard, but this time the scene awaiting Ethan and Grace was transformed. The RV they had once mocked no longer sagged in defeat. It stood tall and polished its metal, gleaming its windows clean and reflecting sunlight. It looked like a home. Henry opened the door, and Rusty greeted them first. A soft tail-wag ears perked a small step forward, as if to say, "Things are different now." Ethan, tall and broad-shouldered like his father, but sharply dressed in office attire, walked with caution, his usual skepticism hidden, but not gone. Grace clutched her wool coat closer, cheeks pink from cold and emotion. Then they stepped inside. In an instant, their expressions melted, eyes widening, lips parting. "Dad," Grace whispered. Her hands rose to her mouth as she took in the glowing wood, the clean lines, the overwhelming warmth. It was like stepping into a storybook cottage. The man they feared was broken had built magic from ruins. Henry handed Grace the cherrywood cradle. Her breath hitched as she traced the birds along the curved sides, tears collecting in her lashes. For a moment she seemed unable to speak, but her tears said everything. Ethan received his gift next. When he opened the miniature tool chest, his stoic facade crumpled. The memory hit him like a storm sawdust in summer air, laughter echoing in a workshop now long gone. "Dad, I—" His voice cracked, and he shut his eyes to steady himself. "I was so wrong." He set the tiny chest down carefully before pulling his father into a fierce hug. Grace joined them. Rusty jammed himself between their legs, tail thumping, refusing to be left out. The three of them laughed and cried all at once, a messy, beautiful reunion in a tiny wooden room that smelled of hope and fresh cedar. Henry finally spoke the words he had buried beneath years of guilt. "I lost myself once. I let ambition swallow everything good in my life. But this—" He spread his hand around the cabin, his eyes shining. "This isn't a business. It's a home." His children nodded, understanding for the first time the depth of his love and the weight of his battles. Days later, Detroit gifted them a rare miracle, a winter morning, with sunlight bright enough to make the snow sparkle. Henry packed the last supplies into the RV. Grace placed the cradle gently beside the bed. Ethan slid the miniature toolbox onto a shelf near the small table. Frank Miller appeared one last time, wiping grease from his hands. The old mechanic had a surprising softness behind that gruff voice. Henry handed him a small, carved wooden bird, an ornament to hang from his rearview mirror. "For everything," Henry murmured. Frank grunted his thanks, but his eyes glistened. Rusty bounded happily into the passenger seat, turning once before settling confidently in his usual spot. Henry took the wheel. Ethan and Grace sat behind him, their families finally mended. The engine started with a deep, smooth purr, the sound of a future beginning. Frank raised a hand in farewell as they rolled down the gravel road and through the junkyard gates. Snowbanks glistened like silver on either side as the RV turned out of Detroit, leaving behind the rusted past. Ahead lay endless roads, endless choices. Henry smiled, looking into the rearview mirror where his children smiled back. Rusty barked once sharp with excitement. "Where to first?" Ethan asked. Henry's eyes softened. He shifted into drive. "Anywhere our hearts take us. Sometimes life leaves us broken in places no one can see. We lose our home, our work, our confidence, pieces of who we once were. But just like an old RV left to rust in a forgotten corner, God never stops seeing the potential within us. With patience, love, and just a little courage to try again, miracles take shape. Not always in flashes of light. Sometimes in the loyal eyes of a stray dog, or in the hands of someone who refuses to give up on you. If Henry's journey taught us anything, it's that redemption arrives quietly. Healing can come from the smallest act of kindness. And when we walk forward in faith, God opens doors we thought were forever locked. So wherever you are tonight, if you feel tired, lost, or unseen, remember God has not finished writing your story. Your miracle may already be on its way. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so more people can find these messages of encouragement. Leave a comment below. We would love to pray for you and your loved ones. May God bless you and keep you. May He guide every mile of your journey ahead. And may you always be reminded that He works in all things, especially the broken, until they shine again.